I want to start today's podcast going over some of the free agency stuff. I could go forever on it. I'm probably going to still go a little too long on this, but I'm going to run through it anyway. Just some of the teams and the observations that I want to make sure that I go over here. And like I said, there's a million different options. But I think the first one that jumps out at me, your Chicago Bulls. So the Bulls did some things, and this is really a carryover where they were at last year, moving a couple firsts for Vooch. I liked it. I'll say this too. I want to tell you that I respect the teams that are like, hey, how about this idea? How about this concept? Let's just be better. Do we want to add better players and try to be a better team? Yeah, okay, cool. Let's do that. You know, everybody that does this championship-driven bullshit, like, it just doesn't exist. There aren't that many options out there for most of these teams. We went over the cap space stuff a little bit earlier. We mentioned how the top 10 draft picks have a recent history here of flaming out. I had a front office guy who texted me after he heard that. He said, you know, I did a study on it, and I hope he's okay. I'm not going to say who did it, but he was like 28% of first-round picks over a 15-year study didn't even make it to a second contract. That's out of the league, a third of the picks. And that's why I think more of the GMs, and, you know, look, Daryl Morey and I even talked about this one time. He's like, I think he thinks most of the stuff I say is wrong, but he was like, you're right about the first-round draft pick thing. He's like, they're a little overrated. And so anyway, now as we continue to sift through all of these challenges that you have in an NBA offseason, because there's so many teams being like, well, what about us? What happened with us? I don't know what offers are real or not. Some I feel better about with the information. Some of the stuff I just go, hey, I know I'm not going to know a good chunk of some of the things that never actually happened because nobody wants to go, hey, here's how close on all the misses that we had. Although some teams do like talking to you about that. All right. So the Bulls, they did get better. They have Zoe, which I like. I mean, Lonzo's I think he's an acquired taste, and also you have to recalibrate what your expectations were for him coming out as a second overall pick. I do like Vooch. I don't love him defensively, but I think he's always been a little overrated. Or, excuse me, a little underrated. That's what I meant to say. Then you add with Zach Levine and then Patrick Williams, which is asking a lot for a second-year kid to be like, all right, you're our power forward, but this team should be good enough to make the playoffs. And I'm talking about a top 8 seed. They were 2 games out of the 10th spot last year. How did that happen? Well, Zach Levine missed about 3 weeks, and the whole Levine thing got kind of weird. And we're going to get to that again later. But then that leads me to like, hey, you're leaving somebody out, not Alex Caruso, which I really like that signing. If you look at any of his defensive numbers and the impact he makes in a game, it's the DeMar DeRozan deal. I kept waiting to find more information on this, a lot like the Evan Fournier deal, where we find out the 4th year's a team option, the Chris Paul deal, where we find out there aren't even full guarantees in that 3rd year. Again, I understand that some of this information, we may not even have all the details until, you know, a month from now on what some of the real numbers are. It's still not as bad as the NFL, which are almost always fake numbers. So you just look at the bonus. But with DeRozan, I kept waiting. I kept wondering, is this really a full 3 years and $85 million guaranteed for 32-year-old DeMar DeRozan? And it appears to be. So yes, are you better? You're better. That's not bad. That's a playoff starting 5. It has to be a playoff starting 5. If you're not making the playoffs with that team, like, something's wrong. But this is where the, hey, let's get better, but then let's also do something that I think is borderline alarming, that you would give this deal to DeRozan. So let's examine it. You moved out a 1st and 2 seconds to do the deal on this one, and also Thaddeus Young and another expiring contract. It'd be one thing in a vacuum just to sign DeRozan for $385, which I still think would be wrong, to then go, let's give up assets. And I always wonder, as most of us will never know, like, how those conversations go. Like, did the Spurs ask for 2 firsts and 2 seconds? Like, why the 2 seconds? I don't love second rounders, whatever. But it was also like San Antonio was going to say no to this. And who were you bidding against? I think that's the part that should scare you. The Knicks had spent all their cap space. They tried for Chris Paul. They weren't going to get him. We're going to get to the Knicks. Oklahoma City probably wasn't going to give a multi-year deal to DeMar DeRozan. The Heat were probably in play. But if you look at what their room was below the tax threshold, we're talking about a contract that starts at less than $15 million a year. And the Bulls decided to get close to 30 for DeRozan, who is very skilled. I liked him coming out of the draft. Like, hey, this guy's got a little of that mid-range. Maybe the mid-range is back after Phoenix's run. But he doesn't hit any threes. And there are a lot of alarming numbers about DeRozan that tell you, for all the raw stuff, hey, scores, the assists are pretty good. You know, he's a good player. He's a good player. But does he actually make your teams better? Because there have been plus minus stuff with DeMar DeRozan over the years. You're like, how come every time it's like a DeRozan season, you go, no, the plus minus impact isn't really what you would expect for this. So I can understand the Bulls saying, hey, let's get a 5. Let's be better. Okay, check. But then to bid against who to get to this kind of deal where DeRozan's 35, making $30 million a year, that's, like I said, alarming. I'd have to be talked into what this means and then why you felt you had to go this high for him. And again, you could say, well, look, the Spurs could have used their own rights to keep him and go high. I don't know. Do you think the Spurs would have given him that kind of contract? Maybe somebody will tell me that they would have. I also think there's a certain number where you go, okay, fine. Yes, we would be better in the short term, but now we're actually giving up assets for what is the biggest question. Like I would say of all the deals done so far this first week of NBA free agency, that was the one where I was like, I can't believe the number on that. And I also wondered if there was a weird Zach Levine part of it where, like, are they worried about Levine's future? He's got 1 year deal left, 1 year on his contract, 19.5. That means he's eligible for like a lesser extension working off of that number. There was another way Chicago could have given him more, but they would have had to use cap space of their own, which is something a team doesn't really want to do. And I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but I just think $85 million for DeRozan and giving up pieces didn't make a lot of sense. Okay, let's get to Kemba Walker. He's 31 years old. If you go by Kemba's traditional stats, you're going to say, hey, 19 points last year, 5 assists, 4 boards, 42 and 36% from the floor, 36 from 3. Okay, this guy's there's some really good. I saw that happening this week. If you look at the traditional numbers, I think that's a pretty big mistake. He played 43 in 56 games in each of the last 2 seasons, and that was with rest. He got shut down in the playoffs, and there's a real physical problem here with Kemba that goes all the way back to Charlotte. And I think the rest of the league knew that, and that's why the Celtics ended up having to throw a first rounder just to get him out the door so that Oklahoma City could absorb the contract and take Horford back. I also think the Celtics wanted Horford. We'll get to them for a little bit here in a second. But as far as who Kemba is, I'm just not sure because there's a version of Kemba where I go, okay, does he attack his rehab in a different way than he did when he was with Boston? Can he figure out a way to turn this thing around at 31 years old? Can he actually be depended on to be there at the finish line? Is he somebody who you can have in the playoffs? Because even with some of the numbers, traditional raw numbers that look good, as somebody who watched a lot of it, I think anybody that watched Kemba the last 2 years, you'd have this moment of hope, and then he wouldn't play for a game, and then he just couldn't hit a shot to save his life, and he was just getting worked by everybody on the other end of the floor. I have no problem. Again, I repeat, I like this deal for the Knicks. Maybe there's some turnaround here that makes sense, but the fact that he was a buyout after the trade tells you the market for Kemba just didn't exist. And that's why the Celtics had to attach some kind of asset to it, most likely. Now, for the Knicks, they wanted Chris Paul. He didn't want to go back and lose. He stays with Phoenix. I'm sure they would have loved Lowry. The bigger ticket item, he ends up in Miami. Even Conley staying with the Jazz. That's not a shock there. They give Fournier 4 years and $78 million, but it's a team option on the 4th year and the $20 million. So it's really like 3 years, a little less than 60. I don't think Fournier solves all your problems, but the rule about cap space, we always get it, right? You got to kind of use it. They couldn't use it in some of these bigger guys. They also re-signed Rose. They re-signed Nerlens and Alec Burks. So the Knicks may have been a great story last year, but as we saw in that Atlanta series, there's just not enough scoring, and they had nothing defensively to handle Trae Young at all. They just didn't. It was a bad matchup for them, and Randall re-signs as well. So I think the team has a chance to be a little bit better, but considering some of the East teams around them, the Knicks could end up having a worse record, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you in the beginning of August what I think the Knicks are going to do in the playoffs because I just don't know. But the Kemba part of it, I love it for the Knicks, but I would temper my expectations unless he finds a way to approach his rehab in a different way, because I think that's also part of the story for Kemba in that whatever he was trying to do wasn't working because physically he was a mess again at the end of the Celtics run. Speaking of the Celtics, it was boring as hell, but I think it was necessity. They bring in Josh Richardson. expiring, Chris Dunn, short money, Canner 1 year. I was a little surprised by the Canner thing because I always felt like Ainge is more of a Canner guy than Brad Stevens was. And you could probably tell that based on the minutes when Stevens was the coach. But if you look at it, under $3 million for 1 year for Canner, hey, can he actually play the position during the regular season and cover us? Does he stay healthy? Yeah, all right, fine. Let's go ahead and do that. They get Tristan's deal out of there. Fournier, I can see. I don't have a problem with the Knicks necessarily, but I also can see a team being like, you know what, I don't think I want to go to $60 million for him. And then moving Kemba out. None of it is exciting. Celtics fans everywhere bored to death. But I actually think it's kind of a good sign with Stevens because I think these were like seasoned front office guy moves for a guy who's doing it for the first time. And it suggests that like Stevens walks into a front office room and is like, all right, how's this work? Like that wasn't what it was going to be like for him. He's still got a staff that was there with Ainge, but all of these moves were basically pretty boring. But I think they kind of had to be boring, as I think their longer term plan would be to reinvent the team around Tatum and Brown and see what their options are instead of doing something else. But I don't think like Lowry was going to go. You know what I mean? Like I don't think the sign and trades, the Dinwiddie stuff, all that kind of stuff. I don't really know that Boston was in play for as much of that stuff. Maybe Lonzo, but I could see Lonzo want to go to Chicago instead of Boston. I mean, Boston's just not a destination for a lot of these younger guys. You got to admit it if you're from the area. By the way, the Lonzo to Chicago thing now ends the longest active rumor that hadn't happened in recent NBA history. Lonzo to Chicago, I think it's over 2 years now. I had heard something like that. And he finally ends up there with a completely different administration, by the way. So, the Heat, they're better. Lowry, it's a lot of money. He ended up getting more than I thought he was even asking for at the trade deadline when I was saying it was 2 for $50, and it ends up even beyond that. They do the Butler extension, which, just kind of the way it works. Yeah, that's a lot of money. We can make fun of it. I mean, Lowry's going to be $31.5 million at 37 years old. Butler is going to be, double check this. Butler's going to be $51.6 million at 36 years old. And we can laugh and say, oh, that's big. But yeah, it's kind of the way the business is done. And speaking of that, as I have two more things that I want to finish up here quickly. The as business is done stuff is this Dinwiddie trade just started multiplying all week, adding more and more teams and trying to figure it all out. And you're like, well, Brooklyn doesn't want to take any money back because of the tax. And that's why Dinwiddie's out in the first place. We can pretend that now Beal's really happy because Spencer Dinwiddie's there. I don't know. I don't know if that makes a ton of sense. Yes, the Wizards have more depth. Maybe they like their team better. They have more flexibility moving in the future because they're off the Westbrook number. All of these things make sense. But I'm not buying like a, hey, I've read Beal was very interested in Dinwiddie. They asked about, okay, fine. I believe all of that stuff. But I still think people just end up doing what they want to do. And ultimately, Beal isn't super happy at some point, although he's been fine with this. He's not hitting the panic button. So Wizards fans, I don't think that nuclear option's happening with Beal anytime soon, maybe later towards the deadline. But I don't think there'll be a moment where Beal will be like, oh, I'm not feeling this. But man, we got Dinwiddie, so I'm sticking around. Like, I just don't believe in that stuff. But what I do believe in, which is something that not only people, fans miss, I think us in the media miss all the time, is how many times GMs will do deals to help the agent, to help the player. Hey, do you guys want to get in on this? All right, well, it doesn't really make any sense for us. We don't have like an immediate win on this. Maybe there's a long-term little piece or whatever. It's so difficult for these transactions. I think a big part of the NBA world and understanding these jobs is that there will be deals that will be done where teams are doing the agent a favor, which doesn't sacrifice a ton here. It's not like, hey, I don't want to give you a first, but I will so your team can, so your client can get a contract with some other team that we're competing with here. I'm just saying, like, I think a lot of this stuff where we'll try to understand why that happened. I think this world is so tight knit, and there's going to be a time when somebody else needs a favor down the road, and teams can burn an agent can burn a team. I'm not saying that obviously doesn't happen, but I think that that's something that you always need to pay attention to when you're like, well, why would anyone go out of their way to do this when there isn't any cap space or all these different things? It's like, look, let's try to find a way to get this deal done, and I'm going to owe you one down the road. The last thing, do you remember when the Nets added LaMarcus Aldridge and Blake Griffin? Of course you do, right? So the headline became the Nets now have a combined 41 All-Star appearances. And I saw a media member say this that are big LeBron fans. They said, hey, look what the Nets had to do, what they had to put together to try to take down LeBron. That's a real thing. It exists. It's out there. Go ahead, look it up. First of all, it's irrelevant because LaMarcus and Blake at that point were no longer all-stars, but you're just trying to throw something together. It's kind of like if Tom Brady tweeted out that he saw Space Jam, SportsCenter's feed would be like, hey, everybody everybody chill out for a second. Brady just tweeted about Space Jam. Like, do we change? Should we have a special show for this? All right. It looks good in a tweet. Hey, 41 All-Star appearances. That's amazing. But it looked even funnier, and it was honestly stupid, to say that this was some attempt now to take down, like, it spoke to, I'm going to argue LeBron's greatness because the Nets added 2 irrelevant All-Stars. All right. Think about the gymnastics of that conclusion. When most teams are just trying to get better, other than the ones that want to be worse, right? Like, I don't know that teams go, hey, do you want to get better? Yeah, let's get better. And then some other team gets better and you're like, hey, do you want to get really better? Like, I didn't Wednesday, but on Thursday I do. Yeah. So as I say that, the Lakers now have 55 All-Star game appearances total. LeBron 17, AD 8, Melo 10, Russell Westbrook 9, Dwight Howard 8, Marc Gasol 3. So we could just chop off 23 of those in relevance. And you know what? It doesn't mean anything. So if you're arguing actually against LeBron or against the Lakers, you'd be like, he needed 55 All-Star appearances combined, 4 MVPs, 4 Defensive Player of the Year, 17 All-Defense, 4 scoring champs, 8 gold medals combined to try to win more. It's also totally reasonable for me to say, hey, at this stage, Melo, Dwight, and Marc Gasol are not exactly All-Star caliber players.